I was looking to make a fairly substantial point in speaking to the kids about talents, because that is actually where we get the word talent from, is from that biblical passage. And I related to that a fair bit. I am someone who has never really had talent in any one exceptional area. My story has been that I'm okay at doing lots of bits of different things, but I wouldn't say I've ever mastered anything or gained expertise in any one area to the point where you could say I had a huge amount of natural talent for it. And over the years, I've just had to negotiate with that and come to accept it. And you might be like that, or perhaps you have had the experience of knowing what it is to have an exceptional area of gifting and talent, and you were always able to do it almost like a prodigy, and it's always been celebrated. Or perhaps you're more like me and you can do a wee bit of everything, jack of all trades and master of none. But the key is in recognizing what you have. And that's what Jesus is speaking to those folks about. And I believe this is, if we get this principle, can massively help us have a lot of wisdom for life, can help us certainly order church life. But I hope that you'll find it relevant as you kind of consider how you walk before God in this world. And I'll try and pull out as much as I can in that regard. When Jesus is speaking this parable in the ancient world, he's using images and handles that people can easily grab onto because it makes a lot of sense to them in their world. In the Roman Empire, a slave that had worked up to the point of getting a fair amount of entrustment in the household, they would quite often manage the master's wealth, which could be substantial. So they had a lot of autonomy and a lot of trust. And very often, actually, anybody in this world who had capital, they would want to invest it, because in the ancient world, most people live at a subsistence level. So not a lot of people have capital to throw around. And those that do, what they want to do is try and lend it out to make more of it. It's a real kind of 1% kind of thing for people who actually have capital to do this. And talking about serious sums, I mean, it's called the bags of gold in this story, and in Mark he uses talents. For reference, a talent in this day and age was about 6,000 denarii of the Roman currency, which if we adjusted for today and for inflation and so on, is about $1,000. So the first one who's given 5, he's got $5,000 to play with, and he's able to get it up to 10 and to make that, and 2 to 4. And the last guy who doesn't fare so well has about $1,000 to play with. So it's enough money for it to be substantial and to do something with. But I want to think about, really, the story doesn't really start with us and what we do, because that's where we like to, and we tend to try and start. As with so many of the parables that Jesus speaks about, it's about the kingdom of God, and it's ultimately about God's rule in that, and then everything flows from that as a response from us. So firstly, I want to think about the fact that it's actually God who makes an investment. God is the one who invests, because he's clearly the master in this story. And God invests in you and I, and has invested in you and I. And then secondly, then I want to think about what our response to that investment is. And thirdly and lastly, what our reward can be. So God's investment, our response, and our reward. Again, Jesus begins the story. It'll be like a man going on a journey who called his servants in verse 14 and entrusted his wealth to them. Now, if anything starts with again, or in other translations it'll say therefore, you've got a clue that it's probably quite importantly connected to what went before. What went before was the parable of the 10 virgins who are at a wedding, and just to summarize that, it was about being ready when the bridegroom comes and not being caught out and caught short. And if you like, the thread running through all those stories, Jesus is telling 2 or 3 stories to get the same point across, is that you don't know the time when you're going to be called upon to show what you've done with what you've been given, if you like. And you don't have this kind of omniscience. He's always contrasting the fact that God alone knows all times and seasons perfectly, and it's not in our gift to know when the future, or how the future is going to unfold. What is within our gift is to be as ready as we can for that. And that's an important point, because this idea of the master going off and leaving people to it, giving them a lot of autonomy, I think that's how most of us experience life and experience our connection to God. Maybe you're different to me, but I certainly don't get lightning bolt revelations at several points every day telling me what to do and what God would like and how the future is going to unfold. Now, you can go to churches and expressions of Christianity where it's a bit more like that, and that's fair enough. But I think these parables actually are to speak to us about what normal life is like when you're trying to walk before the face of God, do the right thing, live your life, and hopefully do a good job of it. And so the master heads off and kind of leaves them to it. And he's saying to them, that's important, because you don't know when exactly he's coming back. You just should have some sort of an idea of what it is you're to get on with. And how do they know that? Well, he entrusts the bags of gold to them, and he then asks to settle the accounts. He uses a specific language of it's time to sort this out. So they should have known that there was going to be something expected with them to do in the interim time. And that's what God does with us. He doesn't intervene, doesn't interject constantly, but he does give us something. And how does he decide what he gives us? He gave each, in verse 15, according to his ability. So this is all about the sovereignty of God, God's infinite and perfect wisdom, and what he does with that. He knows what all his servants are made of. He knows where their skills lie. He knows what they'll probably be able to handle, and he gives them that to entrust it to them to steward and to do something with. And I think I'll probably just apply this one as I go along, because I think as well, that's something that is timeless, but we struggle with. Because particularly in our culture, we are almost conditioned to look out and look around and to, well, for one thing, in a very capitalist society, one thing we're conditioned to do is to look, if we can, with envy and look at either what others have or even just what is being dangled in front of us in terms of advertising, and to be given this impulse and sense of, you actually need that. You don't have enough with what you have at the moment, and you need that. You need either what they have or you need these other things over here. And only then will you have what you need in order to be, whatever it is, happy, successful. And this runs against the grain of that. You know the saying that comparison is the thief of joy. There is actually very little satisfaction or joy to be found in that sense of constant comparison and wondering if we just had a bit more, would we actually be happy? And I'm not talking about poverty as an evil and a scourge. That is not talking about the context of this parable is it's people who are being given a role to do. This is not about basic survival. This is about what we do with the resources that we're given in terms of what we're meant to, how we're meant to walk in the world, our vocation, our calling before God. And it is for God to decide that. That's perhaps not a very popular or an easy message, but it does make sense of a lot of the world as we see it. Man, I desperately wanted to be better at football when I was in my early teens, because I was hopeless. I was always on the bench. I eventually just gave it up because I was that bad at it. But I would have given anything for God to have reordered things a wee bit and to have chosen, when he was handing out talents, a bit what I thought would have been a bit more justly and better. But my life has gone a bit better, and I've had a bit less struggling and straining since I accepted I'm not very good at football, never am going to be very good at football, but there are other things I can do. Maybe not brilliantly, but there are other things that are much better me spending my time, my resources, and my energy with. And there's actually even in the first few verses of this parable, there's just massive freedom in accepting that actually God has ordered the world in such a way. He has made the Ronaldos and the Taylor Swifts, and they have the unfair measure of talent that they do. But we have whatever we have. And that's for us to discover and also then walk before God with that, to do whatever we can to ultimately take our part in his creation and what he's made us for. And so, if you like, that is God's investment in us. And it's going to be different. In this room alone, every single person is going to have a different kind of makeup to that investment of what God has put inside of them. And some of it is obvious. That's what we're talented at, it's what we're good at, it's what we've spent our careers and our vocations doing, or it's perhaps our personality and our qualities and our ability to make others feel loved and safe and valued and all those sorts of things. There's a huge array, but whatever you have is what God's invested in you. And then how do we respond is really the center of this parable. After a long time, the master returned and he settled the accounts. And so the guy with the 5 bags had made 5 more, 2 made 2 more, and he says to them, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful. I'll put you in charge of many things." And then finally, there's the one with the 1 bag. And he says, "Master, I knew you're a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed." So he's saying that he's just ruthless. "So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold on the ground, and see, here is what belongs to you." And his master replies, "You wicked, lazy servant." And it doesn't end well for him. So God essentially gives us, in terms of the kingdom, here's everything God's given you to work with. Here's your natural gifts, your spiritual gifts. Here's all of it. It's up to you now what you do with that. And there's essentially two responses given to us. The first 2 servants do exactly what they were supposed to do. They were given a measure, and what they did was they went and made what seemed like a reasonable amount given the ability and what they had to start with. So there's a kind of equitableness and there's a fairness to it. And then the last one is given ostensibly what the master thought he could handle, and he buries it. And then one of the reasons the master is raging, because he says, you could have even put it in the sling. At the time, the temple usually ran a treasury where you could put it in and get a little bit of interest on it. So he could have even put it there and made just a bit more. And instead, he's been completely passive and just taken his hands off altogether. But his response, we kind of miss it in this culture and this world, but to Jesus' original audience, his response would have been shocking, because he says to him, "Okay, what have you done with the money?" And essentially what that servant does is go, "Well, let me tell you a few things about yourself that explain my behavior and what I did." So he kind of gaslights the master. He says, "It's really your fault that I haven't done anything with this. My children sometimes do this to me." I say, why haven't you got that? And well, you didn't remind me. So they're very good at that as well. But ultimately, I think that's a character defect in them, and it's something I try and work on with them. And we kind of miss that in the story. But the original audience would have been like, you cannot speak like that to the master. And also, it's just not his fault. You had the same opportunities as everybody else did. So what does that look like for us from maybe a personal, but a church perspective? How does church respond in terms of these options of doing something well with the resources we have and perhaps being a bit passive? Well, I think it's obvious that we need to act. Otherwise, we'll just be presiding over a kind of a slow death. So much about building the kingdom, the pictures Jesus uses are about going out and scattering seed and planting things in a garden and trying to given the conditions for growth. Now, yes, ultimately, it's only God who can grow the kingdom and bring people to a sense of knowledge of his love and his power and by his Spirit. But that doesn't mean that we don't have anything to do. It means that everything God has given us, and some of that is money, but some of it is our time and our talents and our abilities and our energies. It's all to be brought before God in a sense of loving service. And we do what we can, and God does the rest. And I would put to you this morning that that's what I hope we'd be able to go. Sometimes that's going to mean taking some risk. There's investment in this. There's taking a punt on some things. And I think increasingly as churches continue to decline, I think that's going to be something that characterizes churches with a bit of go about them from ones that don't, is ones that are willing to have a go at things because they keep seeing that God has invested something in them. They might not be much, they might not be the richest church or the biggest church with the most people, but they've got something. And we have something here in this church, and you and I all as individuals. And it's about doing whatever we can with that, because the opposite is this kind of quiet passivity that I think it's fair to say from this that Jesus is trying to warn us that's absolutely not what God is looking for. I've been in expressions of church where the idea is, well, we kind of need God to come and sort everything out. End times Christianity. There's a whole sect of Christianity. It's bigger in the US than it is here, although it is here too, which is we just need to pray for the end, for Jesus to come and to sort it all out quickly, and he'll, get rid of all the heathens and the sinners, and he'll sort the world out. And it's such a low view of the goodness of the creation that God's put us in and how the world can actually flourish. And also the fact that, well, that's the easiest thing in the world, is to go, it's for God to sort it all out. Because then that means we don't have to do anything. Or even just engage our minds and think about what we might have to be involved or engaged with. So we don't want to have that passivity. But then there's another important lesson here, because what's the master's point? The master says to the wicked servant, you knew what I was like, that I harvested what I did not sow. Okay, you knew all of that. So that should have guided you to realize that you had my money. You had my treasure. See, the lazy or wicked servant, whatever you want to call him, his real problem is that he acts like it's his own. He does what he's comfortable with in terms of the treasure. That's something that kind of temperamentally suits him, to put it in the ground. But he's not actually thinking, really, about what his master is like or what his master would like. He's kind of suiting himself. He's detached, and he's acting as if the master's never actually going to come back. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes, and this is something I've been reflecting on quite a bit, church can function a bit in lots of different places as if it wouldn't really make a difference whether God was real or not, because everything, all the same level of activity or inactivity would just continue, and none of it's motivated by God's Spirit and prayerful inquiry, and it's just, a club. And we want to avoid that as well, because our mission and our reason for being here is that God has called each of us into his kingdom and has given us a role within that. And we discover the fullness of what it is to be a human and spiritually alive as we work that out and fulfill that together. And that's an exciting prospect that we're called into. And the freedom of it, in some ways, is the fact that it's not actually ours. As long as you and I have done our best with it and always remembered that none of it belongs to us. We can't lock it down, we can't take ownership of it, and we shouldn't. Because when you and I are all gone, somebody else will take the kingdom of God forward. It's the most humbling thing. But the worst thing that we could do in response to that is try and hold on to it and go, this is our identity, this belongs to us. What we actually should look to is have that response of do what we can with what we've got, the best we can, and then we move on to our reward. Because ultimately, look at the reward that he gives those who get it right. Come, he says to them, and share in your master's happiness. Now, that was not an ordinary thing for a master to say to his servants, even in the ancient world. And so we're really, by this point, getting the hint that this is not really about money. It's about so much more. And in some ways, the sermon isn't really about money or the church's treasury. It is in part, but it's about so much more. It's trying to set the principles and dig the channels of the direction that we want to go in, and the attitude that we hopefully can have in seeing that what we're doing is for this reward in getting to share in the Master's happiness. And this is something that God gives in many of the parables in order to motivate people, because normally a master like this who had capital and wealth, they wouldn't invite their servants to quote unquote share in their happiness. But that's the difference with God in the kingdom that he builds, is he invites anybody who takes part in it to actually share in his enjoyment of his creation and of his kingdom and what he's made. He essentially says, I know I'm in charge of all of this and I've made it, but I want to not just enjoy it myself. I want you to enjoy it with me. I love the answer to the first catechism. I learned as a child, I've never forgotten it. What's the whole purpose or chief end of man? It's to glorify God, which is what we're made for, and to enjoy him forever. And so many expressions of Christianity forget that last bit, as if it's, got to be careful in case we're enjoying ourselves too much. But the Master says, I want you to come and enjoy my happiness. I'm going to enjoy the fact that the kingdom that I've built is producing fruit and results, and people are coming into it, and people are experiencing the life and the healing of God. And you know what? I want you to enjoy the fact that is happening. That's what I want to do with my Christian life and my life in God's kingdom and in God's church, is I want to enjoy it. I want to enjoy seeing people with their eyes being open to the love of God for them and the difference he can and does make in their lives, because they're perfectly loved through Jesus and they're taken into his kingdom through the work of the cross. And then I want to enjoy going on that journey of faith with them. And then I want to enjoy folks building relationships with one another and us using our treasures and the investments that people bring in so that we're able to keep expanding that and keep connecting with more people who might have never thought that the love and the joy in the kingdom of God was for them, but it is, because God's speaking to them. And that all depends on you and I actually responding to what God's put into us. You see, none of that comes through just having a big enough building or enough money as a church or even enough people or numbers as a church. It is all about the people who are gathered and have been called and brought here by God, recognizing the investment that God has put into them and then responding to that and listening to his Spirit and his leading to what he is calling them to and how he is asking them to take their part and their place. And then it's my prayer and ultimately my hope that all of us get to that point where we hear and enjoy and take part in God's reward. What he says, well done and good and faithful servant. Enjoy your master's happiness, because it too will be our happiness. May God bless his word to us. Amen.